Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pizza Legends Battle Series. In this video, we're going to take the pizzas in our scene and give them actions that they can use against each other. By the end of this, our two pizzas will be taking turns flinging themselves at each other and slowly working down the other's HP. As always, the full playlist is below if you've missed anything. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do in this video is make actions that our combatants can use. And just like we did pizzas as content, like our pizza decks over here, we're going to create a different kind of data store that stores all of our game's actions. So I'm going to create a new file here, just called actions.js under content. I'll say window.actions. It's going to be a new object. Each action is going to be a sub-object within this data store. So I'll bring in one here called damage1. You can think of this as just like a basic move that does some damage to the target enemy, maybe like tackle or slice or something like that. So we'll say it's called womp. We could have a type on it too. Say it's like a fire type or water type. We're talking pizzas here, so it'd be like a veggie type or spicy type. For now, we're going to leave this one to be normal. Each action needs to provide success events that roll out during the battle to kind of tell the player what happened. And so those are going to be an array, and they're going to look a lot like our overworld events in the overworld part of the series here. So like one type will be a text message. It's going to have text on it. It's going to say, something happened. The battle events are going to get real granular on describing every little thing that should play out on the scene. So we may say something's happened, and then we want to show an animation, like maybe to fling the pizza at the other pizza. And so that could be like which animation, we'll define it here. We'll come back to this. And then we need to actually do something that affects the state of our characters. So we'll make a new type called state change, and that's going to be like damage, do damage of 10. We're going to come back to these two later in the video. So combatant is going to choose to use the move called damage1. It's going to put out some text on the screen. Let's go ahead and update the text to be slightly more realistic. Here we can include dynamic kind of templating that the system will take in and inject names. So caster uses womp will become like our pizza uses womp, whatever the pizza's name is. Now for us to start submitting actions, we need some kind of concept of a turn cycle. Like whose turn is it right now? That person should submit an action. So under battle here, I'm going to create a new JavaScript file to kind of keep this nice and organized. It's going to be called turncycle.js. This will be a class, turncycle, constructor. The constructor of turncycle is going to take in a reference to the battle class and then also a callback. And that callback we'll call on new event. The turn cycle will go ahead and call this, and then the battle cycle will know to fire off one of those events. So let's put this on the class. Now our battle class itself is already keeping track of which two combatants are active right now, but we don't have a concept of whose turn it is right now. And so we're going to track that here. It's going to be this.current team is going to be either player or enemy, and we're going to start with player. The magic of our turn cycle is really going to come in this method here. It's going to be called turn, and it's one of these async functions that's going to pump out promises and then wait for those promises to resolve. Let's leave this alone for now and just move on to our init method. Now init's going to be invisible. It's really just going to be pumping out these events that happen, so it doesn't need a container like we normally do. There's no DOM to it. The first thing we're going to have init do is actually launch one of these events. So we're going to say await this.onNewEvent. And let's do one of those type text messages. And the text can just be like, the battle is starting. And because we're awaiting, init must be also marked as async. And then as soon as this is over, we're going to wait for a response from the user to acknowledge that they've seen the message. And then after that, we can go ahead and start the first turn. So we'll say this.turn. Now for us to get this message on screen, we need to be set up and ready to handle it. And so just like we did with our overworld code, if you've been following along with that, we're going to make a new class called battle event that's going to take in a configuration object. And that's what you see right here. That class is going to know what to do when it sees a text message event come through, and that's how we can get it on the screen. So let's go ahead and create a new class, new file called battleevent.js. We'll give it a constructor, and that constructor is going to take in the event and a reference to the battle. The init method is going to do the same thing that the overworld event handler did too, where we're basically going to dynamically call a method on the event itself that matches up with the type of the event that we saw. So we'll make a new method called text message. And so whenever a type comes through, we're going to dynamically look up the method name and then call that. So once this is wired up, init's going to receive the resolver of a promise. And then we're going to go ahead and call the dynamic method name, passing in the resolve reference so that any of these methods can call it and resolve the event. Now we're going to pause on this file for now and just leave it like a message just to get the system wired up to actually get this far to call this. We've created 2 new JavaScript files so far, but we have not yet added them to the page. So we'll go to index.html, down in our battle script section. One's going to be a battle event. One's going to be turn cycle. And then we need our content of actions too. We can go ahead and use our new classes now in our battle.js file. We'll come down to the init method, and after all of the combatant iteration has happened, we can go ahead and start the cycle. So we'll say turn cycle. It's going to be a new turn cycle. And again, its constructor wants a battle, so the reference to this, the battle, and then also that on new event callback. That's going to take in an event, and like we said, it's going to return a new promise. And then in this promise, we can create one of those events, passing in the event that we received. So that's the one that was called up here. It's coming in right here, and a reference to the battle. And then we'll go ahead and initialize the event, again, passing in that resolver. Let's just pause for a second and recap what we've done so far, because this part can feel a little bit daunting at first, which is totally okay. What we've done is set up a simple turn cycle system where basically our turn cycle is going to be in charge of asking the question, hey you, what do you want to do? And then receiving that answer. And the answer is going to come in the form of little digestible events that happen. We're going to receive those events one at a time and then handle them in different ways. And that's what the battle event handler is doing. A text message, for example, will just show up on the screen and wait for the user to acknowledge it. An animation might need to wait for the animation to finish on screen, and that's when it's done, and it can call that resolver. Something like a state change is when we need to maybe calculate damage that's done or add a status to a combatant. All of those things are little bits called events. Now we are all set up to fire off the init of our turn cycle. And as soon as we do that, we're going to receive our first event. Remember, turn cycle and its init, it's going to immediately launch one of these messages. The battle's starting. So let's see if this is working. When I fire up the game here, I can see that that console log message is coming through. So text message is doing something. Now let's actually print the message to the screen here. In our battle event.js file here, let's go ahead and make a new text message instance. We'll pass in our text, and that's on the event in the config object. And then our text message class, which we created in video 9, by the way, and then made better in video 10, also wants to take a onComplete callback. This is going to be fired when the user clicks through the message and acknowledges it. So as soon as that happens, then we can resolve the battle event. So we'll take this callback here and resolve it. Now we need to initialize our text message class here. So we'll say message.init. Init wants a DOM container in which it should put the text message itself, and we want that to go in the battle container. So that's going to be this.battle element. Let's see this in the browser. When I load the page, our typewriter text just appears on screen. As soon as I hit next, it's going to resolve this event, and then we'll be ready to start a real turn. And like I mentioned, just want to call it out real quick, we implemented this functionality and the styles and all that in a previous video. It's all in the playlist below if you missed it. Now I'm back in TurnCycle.js, and once we received our intro message, now we want to kick off a real turn. And so the first thing we need to know is whose turn is it? So what we're going to do is start a concept of a caster. And the caster is basically just going to be a reference to the combatant class that is the caster of this turn. Who's calling the shots right now? Now we can figure out who the caster is just by computing some values from the battle class itself. So we can say caster ID is going to be the battle class's active combatants, the one on the current team, which again, just a reminder of what that looks like. In our battle class itself, we have this little object. If we look up the team, the value of that key will be our currently active combatant. So now that we know the ID, we can get a reference to the actual instance of the combatant class that is the caster. So we'll say caster is this.battle.combatants, and then pipe in that ID. So next we need to ask this caster, what move do you want to use? What action do you want to use? And for that, we're going to use a component that we talked about in the previous video, but haven't actually implemented yet. And it's called the submission menu. And in it, we're going to grab a submission, which is basically which action do you want to use and who do you want to use it on? To get it, we're going to await one of our battle events. So we'll call our new event callback, this time with a type of submission menu and the caster. So again, this is asking the caster, what do you want to do? We're just going to patiently wait here until we have an answer, and that answer will be the submission. Let's go ahead and handle this type. So submission menu, in our battle event file, we need to create a new method that matches that name exactly. So submission menu, it'll take in the resolver. This will be in charge of putting that menu on screen. Now in the previous video, we created a file for submission menu. Let's pull it up here. But it's totally empty. And so now what we can do is start setting up what the submission menu does and then initialize it in our battle event here. So here we go, class submission menu. It's gonna have a constructor. It's gonna have an init, and it'll take in a container. We're not gonna actually use the container in this video because we're gonna have this operate in invisible mode. We'll talk about that in a second. But in the future, we'll actually be injecting some menu that's built up with DOM elements to the screen. And so we'll need a container for that. Now for this one, we'll be adding to it as we go because it will get a little bit more complex. But for now, all we need to know really is who the caster is and then have some sort of onComplete callback that we can call when we know that we're done with a submission. So we'll say this.casters, caster. Now I mentioned invisible mode a second ago. Basically what I mean by that is that even though this is a menu that theoretically a player would use to select what they want, the enemy AI characters are also going to use this menu. But rather than receiving buttons and stuff that they can click on their computers, they don't need to do that. They're just going to automatically decide what they want to do. That decision is going to flow up in the same way as if they were a human player. For this video, we're going to have both the player team and the enemy team operate in that automatic invisible mode, but in future videos, we'll layer in the actual UI that humans can use to submit what they want to do. One more thing we need to know here too is who is the enemy right now? Submission menu is going to be like, which action do you want to use? Who do you want to use it on? We need to know who is a possibility to use it on. So we'll also pass in the enemy here. So before we go any further here, let's make sure that we can pipe all these values into the submission menu as expected. So the first thing we're going to do is figure out who the enemy is. So we'll pop over to turn cycle, and in the same spot that we're figuring out who the caster is, let's also figure out who the enemy is. So we use the similar pattern. Enemy ID is going to be the active combatant on the opposite team of the caster. So if caster's on team player, we're going to look up the enemy value. Otherwise, we'll look up the player value. And then we'll save a reference to the instance just like this. And now we can pipe this into our submission menu. Let's wire up this event type now. So battle event, submission menu. What we're going to do in here is create a new menu. We're going to pipe in our caster, which is on the event, and our enemy as well. And then we're going to give an onComplete callback. And this will take the submission that we receive and then pipe it into that resolver. And we'll just add a little note here. Now that we're all ready and it's all good, we can go ahead and initialize it. So menu.init, and it wants a DOM container, again, that we'll use in the future. That's going to be this.battle.element. Now, like we talked about, in this case, the submission menu can just kind of decide on its own. And so we're going to have a little bit of space for enemy AI logic to happen. That's going to be a method called decide. Now, in a more complex game, the enemy's decision would probably be some complicated logic on the enemy itself. There's probably a better place to keep that. For simplicity in this video, we're just going to randomly choose a move that the person wants to do. So anything they know how to do, they're going to randomly choose one and just use that, rather than making some kind of smart decision. And we'll talk about some of that smart decision stuff in a different video. We need to teach each pizza which moves they know how to do. And so I'm going to go ahead and clean up the screen here for a second. We're going to come into our pizzas.js config object, and we're going to make a new field for each one called actions. And actions is going to be an array of strings, each string being the ID of one of our battle actions here. So I'll take damage 1 and put that on our first pizza here, and I'll just copy it over to the other pizzas. Now, of course, this is just temporary because in the future we'd have different types of like veggie moves that the veggie pizza knows how to do, and the spicy pizza knows some spicy specific moves. That's how the pizzas become different from each other. But our game only has this one action right now, and so until we add more, they're all just going to know how to do the one thing. So let's go back to our submission menu. Now we can call our onComplete callback, passing in, again, the action. What do we want to do? And so this is going to be all actions, and then we're going to dynamically look up a key. So this.caster.actions, let's just start with the first one. And who do we want to target? For now, we'll just default to whoever the enemy is. Now we're definitely going to flesh this out a little bit as we go. The spirit here is that the target can actually be anybody that you want, any combatant that you want. So say that you're using a recovery move or something like that, you probably want to target someone on your team or yourself, but not the enemy. So we're just defaulting to this for now, but soon we'll see how the enemy type can kind of come from the action. Okay, we're almost ready to see the results of all this on screen, but first we need to go into our turn cycle and actually consume the submission that was made. First, we want to get the resulting events that are going to happen. So we'll make a new variable called resulting events. And just for now, we're going to default to the success events that are defined on our action here. In the future, stuff might go wrong and we don't actually get the success events. We'll get other stuff like failing or missing or that kind of stuff. So this will be submission.action.success, and that's an array. Now we can iterate through each event that we have and await the result of each one. So here comes a classic for loop. We're doing it this way here so we can stay in scope of our async function. And so we're gonna take each event and merge some more data onto it. So we'll create a new variable called event. We're gonna spread in the configuration of the event we received, like text message, text, all of that stuff. And then we're also gonna include the submission, the action, the caster, and the target. The different battle event types, like animations and state changes, may need all this information. And now we'll use our friend await, the callback on new event, passing in that event configuration object. And so this is really nice because it looks like synchronous code, but really for each event here, the code is going to stop and wait for each one to complete. Now, after all of these have completed, we can go ahead and move on to the next caster, the next turn. And so all we need to do is really change which team is up right now. Remember, we're checking that up here. So we'll bring in some code that says this.current team is going to be the opposite of whatever the current team is right now. So if it's player, switch it to enemy. Otherwise, if it's enemy, switch it to player. And then we just want to start over. So we'll call this.turn again. Before we fire this up, looks like there's a little typo here. This should be resulting events, plural, and this should also be resulting events, plural. Now when we load the game, we see our intro message, and then we can proceed from it. We'll get our first turn, where we see the success events of our action. So caster uses WOMP, and then when I proceed through this, it should start a turn on the next player. So I'll say next. And now caster uses WOMP. They're both using the same moves, so it'll just be caster uses WOMP. Let's go ahead and add some code that changes out caster to be the actual name of the caster. Here I am back in battleevents.js, and here in our text message event, I'm going to go ahead and back this out. And text, before we just pipe it in, we're going to maybe do a little adjustment to it. So we'll say text is going to start as a new variable that is the event.text, but then we're going to go ahead and start replacing things from the event. So if we see this string caster here, where you want to replace that with the caster's name, same with target, and then also the action name. If we look at our actions config here, the name of the action is kind of baked into the text here. We can go ahead and make this dynamic. It's worth noting though that we won't always want to use this line, and that's why we have it as an explicit event here. Now when I load up our scene and start seeing those messages, the name is replaced, and so we can see Slice Samurai uses WOMP, Call Me Kale uses WOMP, Slice Samurai uses WOMP, Call Me Kale uses WOMP. This is the most boring battle ever because the moves don't actually do anything, and we're going to fix that now. Back in actions.js here, let's go ahead and bring back in our state change event. That's that last one. So it's type state change, it defines damage as 10. In our battle event file, we can go ahead and start handling this type of event. So we'll just create a new method called state change. Takes in the resolver. Now in state change, we can pull the caster and the target from our event. And we can also pull damage to see if that key is around. And if it is around, what we want to do is modify the target to have less HP. And as a nice effect, we're going to have them start blinking. Just kind of a nice little convention that tells the player like, hey, something's happening here. So the pizza will start blinking here. And then we want to wait a little bit and allow that blinking to happen so we have time to digest it, time to see it. And then we're gonna stop blinking and then resolve our event. So here we can just fill this out when to resolve. Something important to talk about in a system like this is pacing, where there's going to be quite a few different cases where we want to introduce a little delay, mostly just so that the person playing the game has time to just digest and figure out what's going on. We don't want events to be happening too fast, otherwise that can be overwhelming. So what we're going to do is actually create a utility to kind of help us with that. It's really just a convenience thing for set timeout, but it's going to help our files look a little bit more clean. So I'll pop over to utils.js, and down here, we're going to add a new one. And this one's going to be called wait. It's just going to take in some milliseconds and then return a new promise. And after a set timeout, it'll resolve the promise. This kind of saves us from writing a bunch of inline callbacks. So when we want to use it, we can say await utils.wait, and then just pass in however long we want to wait. So in this case, let's say 600 milliseconds. And of course, anywhere we use await, we need to go ahead and mark the function as async. And so now our waiting a little bit is complete. To achieve the blinking here, we're going to make a new CSS class. Up here, when we want to start blinking, our target is going to have a reference to the pizza element on it in that combatant class. So we can say target.pizza element class list, add a new class called battle damage blink. And this is just going to apply a CSS animation that we'll set up in a second. After we're done waiting here, we're going to go ahead and remove that animation, clean it up a little bit. Let's create the styling now that actually makes the blinking effect work. So I'm going to open up battle.css, and here we're going to start a little section for animations because we're going to have a few of them. I'll bring in some styles here. The first is a keyframes animation definition. It's going to be called battle damage blink, and this is just a little trick that will toggle on visibility of an element. We'll set up a class name here called battle damage blink. That's the same one we added to our element. That will go ahead and apply that animation and use the steps function to basically toggle it on and off. So it's going to be like visibility on, hidden, and that will just infinitely run while this class is present. The very last thing we need to do for our state change event, at least for this video, is actually modify the HP. We've got all the visual effects going so far, but we're not actually changing the HP. Here we can utilize our combatant update method. And so target is a combatant. We can run update, passing in a new value for HP. And so HP is going to be whatever target.HP is right now, but minus that damage that's present. And if you remember, this update method also updates the scoreboard DOM of the combatant. So we should see the life bars update. With all this in place, let's fire it up and see what it looks like. So we get our message, battle's starting, womp. Call Me Kale uses womp, and see the HP is updating. And they just keep going and keep going and keep going. Eventually we're gonna have a way to end the battle, but for now we can just let them keep attacking each other. So to wrap up the implementation of our womp move, we're gonna add one more battle event type, and that's gonna be animation. So instead of the damage just kind of happening like this, we wanna see this pizza fling and kind of attack this pizza. It's gonna bring the whole thing to life and feel way more fun. So to achieve these animation effects, we're going to set up some CSS animations and classes, and then some JavaScript functions that will be responsible for looking at our pizzas and adding and removing animation classes at different times. So I'm back in our battle CSS file towards the bottom at the animation part, and I'm going to bring in another one here. And this is going to be called battle spin right. It's going to take the pizza and basically take it from the left side of the screen and fling it up and towards the right side of the screen. So we start stationary with no rotation, but then 25% of the way in, which is going to happen pretty quick, the pizza is going to jut towards this position, which is 100% of itself to the right and then up a little bit too. We're also going to rotate as we get there. Then at 100%, we want to return back to where we started. And so it's kind of going to fling over there and then slowly make its way back. This battle spin right class is just a way for us to apply the animation to an element. We're also going to bring in styles for the exact same thing, but for coming to the other direction. So say you're on the enemy side, we need the values of the animation to be a little bit different. Same concept though, stationary, to the left, move back to where you started, and then a class for applying it to an element. Back in our actions.js file, I'm going to bring in this commented out type. So it's going to be type animation, and then the animation, we need to set a name for the function that we want to fire. And the function is going to be the thing that kind of adds and removes those classes. And so we're going to call this one spin. So in our battles directory here, let's make a new file called battleanimations.js. And this is going to be a window level object. And in it, there's going to be a bunch of methods, and the methods are going to line up with those function names. So we'll say an async function here called spin, and these functions are going to take in the event and an onComplete callback. Now the idea here is that you can define as many different animation types as you want for the whole game. You can go crazy, maybe making a unique one for every type of attack you have, but in the event that you want to reuse an animation, it's nice that they're kind of decoupled in this way. There's just a bunch we'll have to choose from. Humble beginnings, of course, we're just going to start with this one. So first we're going to pull out pizza elements that we want to interact with DOM-wise. So we'll say the element is going to be the caster of the event's pizza element. And now we need to determine which class we want to add. Remember, we have a right version and a left version. That's going to be basically, are you the player team or enemy team? Because that's where the positions are. So we'll bring in some logic here that figures out the class name. If event.caster.team is on player, then we'll use the right class. Otherwise, we'll use the left class. And now let's go ahead and add that class to our element. Now, as soon as that animation is done playing, we want to make sure that we remove it from the element. We want to remove this class that we're adding. So down here, I'm going to add an event listener to our element called animation end. And that's going to fire, like we've seen before, as soon as that animation is done playing. When it is done, we can take the element and remove the animation class name that we just added. That lines up with the variable up here. Once it's done, we don't need this event listener anymore, so we can utilize the config saying once true, and then the browser will just remove the event listener for us. So now we need to decide when to call this onComplete callback. At first glance, you might think, well, let's just call it when the animation's over, but that's not actually exactly what we want in this case, because in that event, the pizza would make contact with the other pizza, and then make its way back to where it started, and that's when the animation is going to end. And so it would feel kind of funny if you don't see the HP reduction happen until after the pizza returns to its starting point. Instead, we want to time it so this event actually completes right around when that pizza collides with the other pizza. So we just need to do a little bit of timing tuning to make that happen. So here we're going to wait about 100 milliseconds before continuing the battle cycle. So after 100 milliseconds, we can go ahead and continue by calling this onComplete callback. The animation itself won't be done yet. Remember, we'll be about 25% of the way through, but this timing just feels pretty good to me. And again, the spirit of this is to make sure that we see the HP reduction happen right when the pizzas collide. So let's head over to our event file, battle event. And at the bottom here, we'll add a new event type. Again, it's got to line up exactly and match the name exactly as the event type, which is just animation, taking in the resolve. This is going to be like the simplest one ever. I love it. Here, we just want to look up the function based on the animation key that we've been given in the event. And so remember, actions, the animation is spin. And so we want to look up the function name spin on our object here, which is window.battleanimations. So we can say battle animations this.event.animation. And now we want to call this function, passing in the event, and then how to resolve it. And remember, we can just add more animations to the game by defining functions here, and then referencing the name in our animation event type here. Let's quickly include our battle animations file in the page here. So at the bottom, we'll say battle animations. Now it's loaded and ready to go. Let's see what it looks like. So now when our pizzas use the action, right between the text message and the state change, we're going to see our animations fire. See the pizzas kind of rotate and smack each other. To my taste, though, it looks like the player side one is a little tame. I think we need to intensify it. So hopping back into battle.css, I'm going to take the battle spin right keyframe, and instead of going 100% of itself to the right, that just doesn't look it doesn't look right to me. Let's go 175 pixels, which again is scaled up. So now when I load, the player side has way more spring to it. That's maybe a little too hot. Let's come down to like 155 and then come up by negative 30 pixels or so. There we go. Feel free to tweak these values however you want. Go nuts with making the animations fun and different. They really go a long way for the player. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end. As always, if you're getting value out of this, I really appreciate when you hit the like button and subscribe for the whole series. If you have a game project in the works, or you have any questions about this project, you should hop in our Discord server. We got a great community of people there making games, and we'd love to have you there. The link to that is in the description below. There's also a Ko-fi donation link if you want to help support this channel. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.